The French and Indian War, prelude to a global conflict. The French and Indian War, fought from 1754 to 1763, marked one of the most significant turning points in early modern history. Known globally as the 7 Years' War, it involved nearly every major European power and transformed colonial empires across the world. In North America, the conflict centered on control of territory, trade, and influence between Britain and France, each supported by various indigenous nations. Far from being an isolated regional dispute, it was part of a global reshuffling of power that ultimately set the stage for both the American Revolution and the modern international order. The origins of the French and Indian War were rooted in imperial rivalries and territorial competition. Following the Age of Exploration, both France and Britain had established vast colonial holdings in the Americas. France controlled Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, while Britain's colonies lined the Atlantic seaboard. Between these spheres of influence lay the Ohio River Valley, fertile, strategically positioned, and deeply contested. Throughout the early 18th century, British colonial expansion pressed westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The French, alarmed by this encroachment, began constructing a series of fortifications stretching from Lake Erie to the Ohio River, effectively linking Canada with Louisiana. British settlers, traders, and investors considered this maneuver a direct threat to their ambitions. At the same time, indigenous nations who had long inhabited the region found themselves caught between two colonial forces vying for dominance over their lands. Economic interests intensified the conflict. The lucrative fur trade depended on alliances with indigenous peoples, access to hunting grounds, and control of waterways. British traders from Pennsylvania and Virginia began challenging French traders in these markets, sparking diplomatic and military incidents that would culminate in war. By 1754, the fragile peace that had characterized earlier decades collapsed entirely. The first major clash occurred in 1754, when a young officer named George Washington led a force of Virginia militia into the Ohio Valley to confront the French. After a brief skirmish at Jumonville Glen resulted in the death of a French officer, the French retaliated by attacking Washington's hastily built Fort Necessity, forcing his surrender. Though minor by military standards, the incident triggered a diplomatic crisis between France and Britain. In 1755, British authorities dispatched Major General Edward Braddock to expel the French from the Ohio region. His campaign ended in catastrophe near Fort Duquesne, where a combined force of French soldiers and indigenous allies ambushed and decimated his army. Braddock was mortally wounded, and his defeat demonstrated that European-style tactics were poorly suited for North American terrain and warfare involving guerrilla strategies. The same year, the British launched other offensives against French positions in North America, including attempts to capture Fort Niagara and Fort Crown Point, but with little success. The French, under leaders such as Louis-Joseph de Montcalm and Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, effectively leveraged their alliances with indigenous nations, maintaining flexible, mobile forces that could strike quickly and retreat into wilderness areas. While the fighting in North America began as a regional colonial war, events soon escalated into a global conflict. By 1756, Britain and France officially declared war, and fighting spread to Europe, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. The 7 Years' War thus became the first truly global war in history. In Europe, the conflict pitted Britain and Prussia against France, Austria, Russia, and Spain. The European theater consumed immense resources and shaped the war's global outcome. Britain relied heavily on its Royal Navy to blockade French ports, disrupt trade, and support overseas operations. France, though militarily formidable, faced financial and logistical difficulties maintaining its far-flung empire. In India, the war played out between the commercial empires of the British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes, whose rivalries mirrored those of their parent nations. Clashes in Bengal and southern India would eventually secure British dominance over the subcontinent, laying the foundation for the British Raj. By 1757, the tide of war began to turn decisively in favor of Britain, largely due to the strategic vision of William Pitt the Elder, who became Secretary of State. Pitt believed that victory in North America was the key to global supremacy. He increased military spending, appointed capable commanders, and relied heavily on the Royal Navy to isolate French colonies and cut off their supplies. British forces seized Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island in 1758, opening the gateway to the St. Lawrence River. Meanwhile, General Jeffrey Amherst captured Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and a force under General James Wolfe advanced on Quebec. On September 13, 1759, Wolfe's army scaled the cliffs of the Plains of Abraham and defeated Montcalm's forces outside Quebec City. Both commanders were killed, but the victory effectively sealed the fate of New France. In 1760, the British completed their conquest by capturing Montreal. French power in North America was broken, though indigenous nations continued to resist British incursions long after the formal end of fighting. With the surrender of French forces in Canada, the North American theater of the war came to a close. The involvement of indigenous nations was central to the French and Indian War. Neither European power could have waged war effectively without indigenous alliances. Many indigenous groups, including the Huron, Abenaki, Ottawa, and Algonquin, sided with the French, partly due to long-standing trade relations and France's comparatively limited settler presence. The British, however, drew support from the Iroquois Confederacy, especially the Mohawk. To indigenous nations, the war represented not an abstract imperial rivalry, but a struggle to preserve autonomy, territory, and access to trade networks. They maneuvered diplomatically, often shifting alliances to avoid total dependence on one power. Despite this, the eventual British victory drastically altered the balance of power in North America. With France eliminated as a colonial power, indigenous peoples lost a crucial counterweight to British expansion. The result was increasing encroachment on their lands and the erosion of their sovereignty. Following the war, this discontent erupted in Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763-1766, a widespread indigenous uprising against British forts and settlements. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, it underscored the instability of Britain's new empire and the grievances that would shape their future conflicts. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763. Under its terms, France ceded almost all its North American possessions. Britain gained Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi River, including the valuable sugar islands of Grenada and Tobago in the Caribbean. Spain, which had entered the war on France's side, ceded Florida to Britain but received Louisiana in compensation. The treaty dramatically reshaped the geopolitical map. Britain emerged as the world's dominant colonial and naval power, while France's empire was reduced to a few Caribbean islands and small holdings in India. For the British, the victory brought immense territorial gains, but also staggering debts, prompting a series of new taxes and imperial policies designed to recoup costs, policies that would soon ignite colonial resistance in America. While the British public celebrated their newfound global supremacy, the reality of administering such a vast and varied empire posed significant challenges. The cost of the war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt, forcing Parliament to seek revenue from the colonies through measures such as the Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765. These policies, rooted in London's belief that colonists should help pay for their own defense, instead spurred outrage across the 13 colonies. In addition to financial strain, Britain faced the challenge of governing its new territories. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, sought to stabilize relations with indigenous nations by prohibiting colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, this decree infuriated settlers eager to claim the rich lands of the Ohio Valley. Many saw it as a betrayal of the sacrifices they had made during the war. Moreover, the war had subtly altered perceptions of identity and authority. Colonial Americans, who had fought alongside British regulars, began to view themselves as capable of self-defense and less dependent on imperial control. At the same time, friction between British officers and colonial militias during the war had exposed deep cultural and political divides. The seeds of American independence were thus sown in the aftermath of Britain's greatest imperial triumph. Globally, the 7 Years' War shifted the balance of power in profound ways. In Europe, the conflict confirmed Britain's naval dominance and Prussia's military prowess under Frederick the Great. France's loss of its North American and Indian possessions led to internal reforms and financial pressures that would eventually contribute to the French Revolution 3 decades later. Spain, though compensated with Louisiana, suffered humiliation and recognized the decline of its maritime strength. In Asia, the war consolidated British influence in India following the Battle of Plassey, 1757, and the Treaty of Paris. The British East India Company's dominance over Bengal marked the beginning of 2 centuries of British rule in the subcontinent. The global reach of Britain's power after 1763 laid the foundations for what would later become the British Empire's Pax Britannica. The French and Indian War also had lasting cultural and intellectual repercussions. In Europe, it stimulated debates about empire, governance, and economics. The writings of Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Adam Smith reflected growing skepticism toward mercantilism and colonial exploitation. In Britain, the expense and administration of new colonies prompted early discussions about imperial reform and representation. In North America, the war reshaped relations among colonists, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. The movement of troops and populations during the conflict accelerated interactions between disparate communities, spreading ideas as well as diseases. Missionary work, frontier trade, and military service brought greater cultural blending, but also deepened racial hierarchies and displacement. For indigenous nations, the war marked both a moment of agency and a tragedy of betrayal. Their alliances and military skills had determined the course of many battles, yet they found themselves marginalized in the post-war world. The British government's inconsistent diplomacy and military reprisals reinforced patterns of mistrust that would persist for generations. Historians have long debated the significance of the French and Indian War. Traditional British narratives celebrated it as a triumph of liberty and civilization over absolutism and Catholic autocracy. French historians, conversely, viewed it as a story of decline caused by administrative inefficiency and strategic overreach. Modern scholarship offers a more nuanced perspective, emphasizing the complexity of indigenous participation, the role of economic imperatives, and the global interconnectedness of the conflict. For the American colonies, the war stands as both an end and a beginning, the end of French imperial competition in North America and the beginning of a new political consciousness among colonists. Many future revolutionary leaders, George Washington, Thomas Gage, and others, cut their teeth during this war, learning lessons in leadership, logistics, and imperial politics. The French and Indian War is also seen as a precursor to modern total war, integrating theaters across continents and involving the collective resources of empires. Its legacy extends beyond military history into themes of nation building, cultural exchange, and the negotiation of identity in a global context. The French and Indian War and the wider Seven Years' War transformed the 18th century world in ways few contemporaries could have foreseen. What began as a skirmish in the forests of the Ohio Valley escalated into a global struggle that redrew the map of empire and altered the destiny of nations. For Britain, it was a victory that brought dominion, but also discord, a triumph that sowed the seeds of rebellion in its most valuable colonies. For France, it marked the decline of overseas ambitions and set in motion a period of national introspection. For indigenous peoples, it ushered in a new and often devastating chapter of displacement and resistance. By reshaping power across continents and revealing the economic and political tensions of imperial rule, the war set the stage for the revolutionary changes that would define the late 18th century. In this sense, the French and Indian War was not merely a prelude to the American Revolution, it was the hinge on which the history of the modern Atlantic world turned.